What's going on, everybody? Preacher Reads here, and I've asked some fellow booktubers to recommend horror novels for fantasy fans. So if you're someone who loves fantasy and you're looking to dive in to the horror genre or just looking for more horror recommendations, you are in the right place. Let's get started.
Hey, what's up, bookworms? Are you looking to get into horror and you don't know where to start? Well, I have a recommendation for you, and it's going to be Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. Now, the reason that I go this way is because I don't feel like you got to be a great horror fan to appreciate the beautiful, beautiful writing style of Ray Bradbury. Ray Bradbury very much was a Thomas Wolfe of his generation, and he is an absolute wordsmith. He can write something that's completely terrifying, but you can kind of look at it and be like, wow, that's a beautiful string of words he put together there. But great, great supernatural coming-of-age story, something I think is key to making horror work. It's to put you in the shoes of younger children and seeing how the horror affects them. But also with this, it puts you in the eyes of a father who is facing his own problems with getting older. And I think it has so many things on so many different levels that no matter what age you're at, you're going to find something to relate to in this book, be it remembering what things were like for you as a kid, or maybe, hey, struggling with your own issues in fatherhood. This has all those things in it. Ray Bradbury, one of the best of all time. And guys, you will not be disappointed if you start with Something Wicked This Way Comes.
What's up, Book Beast? Thank you to Preacher Reads for inviting me to be part of this collab. One of my favorite horror books that I have ever read is Midnight Mass. Put a picture up here because I have the book, but in a horrific scene, it fell behind my bookshelf all the way to the ground, and I'm not taking the books off to get to it. So you'll have to do with this image. But anyway, it's my favorite horror book of all time, by one of my favorite authors of time, the author of the Repairman Jack series, which you should also check out. But Midnight Mass focuses on three main characters during a vampire apocalypse, and it's very cool. You have a disgraced priest who has become an alcoholic and kind of given up on life. You have a young homeless girl who's one of only two people who still talk to the priest. And you have the other person that talks to the priest, and that is a nun, the priest nun, who also happens to be a BA fighting vampire killing machine. The three of them stand up against this vampire apocalypse to try to save the world, and it's really good. The vampires are terrifying, and it's got some really good, deep character work and found family, and it's good. It's real good. I really enjoyed it, and you should check it out. Thank you again, Preacher, and I hope that everybody checks out Midnight Mass and all the other awesome books on this list in this video. Until I see you in the next one, devour your TBRs, be brave, be beautiful to one another, and be beastly. We'll see you, everybody.
What's up, everybody? Jake here from Nerd Level Rising, and Preacher asked me to come on and recommend something with a horror flavor to it for you fantasy fans. And if you're anything like me, who hasn't read any just straight up horror yet, you need something to bridge the gap, right? And you know what's going to do that for you? Berserk by Kentaro Miura. I know this is a manga. Not everybody has tried manga before. It's kind of weird reading from right to left sometimes, but once you get used to it, it's awesome, right? It's awesome. Huge manga fan. This story, wow. Let me say on the front end, this is very dark, okay? This has every trigger warning, very, very graphic, nothing fades to black. There's all the gore, body horror, violence, that's all in here, but also, we'll say violence of all kinds, okay, is in here, and it doesn't pull any punches, okay? So keep that in mind before you jump into this, but if you still want to give it a shot, this has some of the deepest, most complex, most well-realized characters that I've seen in fantasy as a whole. This has all those same adjectives for the themes: existentialism, finding your place in the world. Is everything predetermined, or do we have free will? Dealing with, processing, living with trauma and the struggles of life and emotional upheaval. And there's so complex relationships in those dynamics, religious persecution. There's so much packed into this story. I cannot recommend it highly enough for those reasons. This is, at its core, a dark fantasy story, but there is a heavy heavy horror element to this. You'll see probably the Golden Age arc is probably the most common, the most popular arc, the most well-known arc, and that's the most sort of high fantasy that we see in this. Kingdoms and knights and battles and all this kind of stuff, right? But cosmic horror is a massive pillar of this story. And if you're into that, I think you're going to like this, especially if you can deal with a lot of the violence and everything that's in here. So give it a shot. It is not completely finished. I will admit that. Kentaro Miura did unfortunately pass away before he could finish the story, but where he left it is a perfectly fine ending place, and it's very satisfying. You can kind of make up your own little epilogue by the end if you would like. If you are like me and you want the full actual ending, they are continuing it, and they're very slowly, few and far between, still putting out new chapters based on his notes and everything. So we will hopefully, fingers crossed, someday get that real full ending. But nonetheless, fantastic, very satisfying story. Can't recommend it enough. Go check out Berserk.
All right, guys, for my first pick, we have A God in the Shed by J.F. Dubois. Now, this is like season 1 of True Detective meets Stephen King. There have been murders in a small town, and this is done so well in the same light as Stephen King when he's dealing with a small town. There is a God who seems to be influencing and behind these murders, and you're going to find out a lot more about it through the lens of a small girl. Now, this book is awesome. I think you should check it out. It's dark, it's weird, it's fantastical, it's complex, and it's got an awesome ending. Check out A God in the Shed.
All right, I am so happy, Preacher Reads, that you asked me what horror to get into for a fantasy fan. Oh, I'm a horror fan. You're a horror fan. We go way back with our love for horror. Look, this is it, man. If you love fantasy and you want a little bit of a taste of horror, I'm going to say Empire the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. This is like, oh, you got some fantasy in my horror. No, you got some horror in my fantasy. It's peanut butter and chocolate. It is so, so good. This is that epic fantasy quest. You're going after the Holy Grail to bring about this world that's shrouded in darkness and has no more daylight so the vampires can take over. It's that epic quest with a dark hero, and it's got that thread of Gothic horror. It's so dark and delicious in the world building all the way through. It's got that breath of horror that you love. And even if you don't love it, if you want a fantasy tale, try this out and you might, by the end of it, just be a horror fan. That's why I'm saying try Empire the Vampire by Jay Kristoff.
If you like fantasy, what horror book should you read? I have one for you, because this is one of those books that I at first struggled a little bit with, but then I told myself I need to finish this because this is the king himself. And he does not let me down. It was weird. It was shocking. And that book is going to be Lacey's Story by Stephen King. We have a husband and we have a wife. The husband is a writer. He's a very successful writer. He's managed to make a great career out of it. You will see a lot of similarities to Stephen King himself. I know. He always says that I don't put myself in my characters, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Read this book and then try and tell me one character in this book is not Stephen King. He also writes horror novels and thriller novels and psychological thriller novels. He has a huge fan following. His fans are ride or dies. There is a particular fan, he's taken this to another level. One of the main conflict points, something very traumatic happened to the author. You are viewing this all through the wife's perspective. She's trying to learn more about him, trying to learn about his past, trying to learn why he has all of this trauma, that's also led into a lot of his writing. When we find out what his past really is, it's crazy. It's horror. It's got some gruesome stuff in it. It is so magic realism to the point where as I was reading this, I kept thinking to myself, is this real? If you like fantasy, this is that. I'm telling you, you're going to be confused, but I promise you that it's worth it when you get to the end. I don't know. I think this book is real. That's how I feel about this book. It's fantasy and it's magical realism, but in my head, I think this is real. I think this is a memoir to an extent. If you're up for a challenge, Lacey's story is the one for you. Thanks so much, Preacher, for having me on. If you haven't subscribed to his channel already, what are you doing? Just do it.
So the horror book that I would recommend to fantasy readers is We Used to Live Here by Marcus Kilwer. This is a horror mystery thriller that sometimes feels like it might have some fantastical elements to it, but this is absolutely a book that you can burn through very quickly, and it is a book that is going to have you questioning your own mind and what reality really is.
What is going on, guys? It's Josh over at The Reformed Reader, and Preacher asked me for some horror recommendations for fantasy readers, so I'm going to cheat, and I've got a little bit of a stack here. So I'm going to say, for the fantasy reader that doesn't really want to leave the fantasy genre too much, I would recommend The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is sort of that cosmic horror or kind of fantasy horror. It's got that sense of dread in it. So if you don't want to leave the fantasy genre too much, this is a good place to start. But for those of you who are looking for something maybe with a little comedy, or maybe it's got some levity to it every once in a while, and maybe is leaning more towards our world, I'm going to recommend The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. This is a fantastic urban fantasy series. It definitely has some horror elements. He tends to face off against some of your more classic monsters in these books, at least in the first few. Can't recommend this series enough. So this is another great place to start. Then for those that want to really lean more into the horror part, and they're looking to dip their toes outside of the fantasy genre, I would recommend Swan Song by Robert McCammon. This gets pretty dark. This is set in our world. It's got a little bit of a fantastical element to it, but this is a fantastic book if you're not afraid of something thick. And lastly, for those of you who maybe those don't meet your specific taste, and you're looking for something that is just, I want something that's just straight horror, something that I can really sink my teeth into. There is nothing that I could recommend more as far as horror goes than Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is one of my favorite books of all time. It's a classic for a reason. This is, if you're looking for horror, I don't think you can get much better than this. This is your story that has that looming state or that looming sense of dread throughout the entire book. I would definitely recommend picking this one up. So thank you guys so much for watching. Preacher, thank you for asking me to be part of your video. Hope these help, and I will see you guys on the next one.
All right, guys, I've got another pick for you, and it is Lovecraft Country. Now, this book has an HBO series, if I remember correctly. It's a really good series, but it goes beyond what you find in this book. This book is a Lovecraftian horror set around the 1950s and dealing with issues around segregation and how African Americans are treated, especially in the South. And it uses this social commentary and it talks about it within this awesome cosmic horror setting. If you have not read Lovecraft Country, I think you should pick it up. You should try it out. It has some really great nuance and subtleties as it dives into an important topic, but also uses horror as a genre so well to do so. Check out Lovecraft Country and let me know what you think.
Hey Preacher Reads, Andrew's Wizardly Reads here, and you asked me for a horror recommendation that fantasy fans will love. And for me, the only clear answer, well, it's the Nightmareland Chronicles by Daniel Barnett. I love this series. It's got great horror elements. It's got nightmare fuel, literally. And it's got this great baked-in quest-like element that unfolds across 6 different entries. I absolutely love this series, and I highly, highly recommend that people check it out. It's got found family, it's got survival, it's got post-apocalyptic, it's got walking around nightmares, but it's also, just like I said, got this fantastic built-in quest of this man who is on this journey to try and reconnect with his estranged daughter in the apocalypse. And it's so incredibly good.
Wasabi gangsters, that one's for you, Preacher. You guys must be wondering, Chance, did you do a take for 30 seconds, then realize that the mic's off? No. Why would I do that? So I'm here to recommend some horror books for fantasy fans, and I have pretty much only 2 that I've read. And I'm going to go with the first one I read. If you are an epic fantasy fan, you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, you're a fan of the epic, the I want to say traditional 3-act structure, but that doesn't really have it. The story of good versus evil. The Stand by Stephen King. Well, that's upside down. The Stand by Stephen King. This puppy is the classic tale of good versus evil, and I believe Stephen King even made this in with inspiration from Lord of the Rings. Funny enough, so that's my first recommendation. The character work in there is phenomenal. There are definitely some things that if you get the uncut version that you're like, oh, okay, that's interesting choice. But yeah, that's The Stand. That's the first one. I'm going to go for 2 because I'm going to break all the rules. Discovery by J.A.J. Minton, John, Amy, and Jacob Minton. The family over at Talking Story. I'm sure you've heard about this by now because this is fantastic. And now I'm mentioning it next to The Stand on purpose because I have not read cosmic horror until reading Discovery. And I left reading Discovery feeling a similar experience of The Stand, just in general, just the post-apocalyptic feel. And I'm going to use the word wasteland, but that's too ambiguous. It doesn't really do justice to Discovery because it's not really like that. But the highs of The Stand are really hard to beat. Stephen King's highs and his climaxes are just hard to beat. But as far as sustained enjoyment goes, which I also tend to rank my books based on just how much I enjoyed them over the course, like how consistent were they? How consistent was my satisfaction? And Discovery topped The Stand for me in that category, if I'm being honest. Now, these are the only 2 horror books I've read. I'm sure there are people who are like, oh, who have read all of Stephen King, including Preacher, who might disagree, or I don't know, maybe you'll agree, but I don't know. I love Discovery. I know that you're reading it right now. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts as you go through it. And everybody else, if you're into epic fantasy and you want some great character work, you got to pick up Discovery. You got to pick up The Stand. And then let me know your thoughts. All right. I'll see you guys later.
Hey guys, Britton here, also known as Samoki Dude, and I am here thanks to Dustin today, and thank you, Dustin, for inviting me to talk about a horror book that I think fantasy fans would enjoy. Now, if Dustin wouldn't mind, I'll talk about a comic today instead of an actual book, but I think fantasy fans will enjoy the one I have today, and the comic technically, that I'm talking about today is Hillbilly by Eric Powell. Who some, if you're a comic book fan, might know from his series The Goon, which is also one I recommend quite highly. But I recommend Hillbilly because if you're a fan of stuff like Conan the Barbarian or Elric of Melniboné, this is basically that kind of character, except in a Southern Gothic setting. He goes after witches and haints and stuff like that. And it's also just gorgeously illustrated, and it also really plays with the sword and sorcery genre while also having it in a kind of Southern Gothic, very heightened reality. It's really good. I've only read this first volume here, but I've really enjoyed what I've read of it so far, and Hillbilly is a lot of fun, and if you're a fan of stuff like Conan or Elric or stories about guys wandering around killing things, even Berserk, if you're fond of Berserk, you might enjoy this story. It's really a lot of fun, and I enjoy this comic quite a bit. I do need to get some of the other volumes of the series, though, because I've only read this first one, but this first one is well worth the read. It's a bunch of short stories. They're all standalone. So, yeah, check it out. Hillbilly. It's a really good read.
All right, guys, my last recommendation is going to be Hex. This book is nuts. Imagine a small town, but there is a witch who is haunting this town, and she can't really do anything because her mouth is sewn shut. But what would happen if that mouth sewn shut went away and she was able to be as powerful as her abilities? This book gets crazy quick, and it is fantastic. I think severely underrated in the horror genre, and it has some cool fantasy magic elements. Check out Hex and let me know what you thought about it.
So what is the perfect horror book for a fantasy fan? Now, I didn't really need to think too hard about this one because I think It by Stephen King, or T if it's upside down, is a perfect horror book for any fantasy fan that wants to try more horror. First of all, they will feel comfortable with the page count, because this is one chunky, big, epic scale story. It does take place across 2 timelines with multi-POV, so it has really got that complexity and large scale of a lot of fantasy books. However, it's also really accessible and easy to follow. It's very grounded. This does take place in the real world, and it is an icon. It is an icon of the horror genre. I mean, who doesn't recognize Pennywise the Clown? And I must say, the ending has a very Sanderlanche ending, is very fantasy-esque in the way that it is structured, and just the level of scale and the antagonist and kind of the resolution is just epic and amazing. Apart from that one scene, if you've read it, you know, not talking about it, I just pretend it's not there when I read it. It is not canon in my head, so definitely check out It by Stephen King.
Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you got some great horror recommendations. Make sure you go down into the description and go follow all of these channels that were in this video. Subscribe to them, give them some love. Thank you guys so much who participated in this video. I hope you guys found some horror recommendations that you're going to enjoy. If you could, support this video and this channel by subscribing, liking, and checking out more videos to come. If you're watching this on release day, I have a live stream tonight with Jake from Nerd Level Rising. I hope you guys will come hang out with us at 7 p.m. EST on his channel. If you could, please leave a comment. Tell me about some horror books that you love that you think fantasy fans might enjoy. All right, guys, have a great day.